My name is Ellen, and I am 70 years old. As a retired agronomist, I meticulously transformed our family farm into a thriving, ecologically sound enterprise worth $2.5 million. For 4 decades, I balanced rigorous scientific research with the demanding physical labor of farming, sacrificing personal comforts, and countless opportunities to build something lasting. I worked through blistering summers and bitter winters, testing soil compositions, implementing sustainable practices, and turning what was once struggling farmland into a model of agricultural excellence. I instilled in my children, Mark, Sarah, and Peter, a love for the land, believing they understood its intrinsic worth beyond monetary value, envisioning a living legacy that would sustain our family for generations. Then at what I thought was a routine family meeting, my youngest son, Peter, ambushed me with a demand that shattered my world. He brazenly insisted I sell our farm immediately to cover his $500,000 debt. He revealed his desperation with a cruelty that took my breath away. Mark and Sarah fell silent, their faces turned away from my pleading eyes. "This farm is dead weight. You're crazy to hold on to it," Peter yelled, utterly devoid of humanity or respect. My grandson, Ethan, publicly mocked my dirty farm life, laughing at my life's work. My legacy, my family's heritage, my very identity were being brutally dismissed and destroyed. I felt utterly devastated, profoundly alone, facing an unthinkable betrayal from the people I'd sacrificed everything to nurture. Yet as despair threatened to consume me, an agronomist's unwavering determination for sustainable value ignited a cold fury. What Peter, his wife, Brenda, Mark, Sarah, Ethan, and their corporate lawyer didn't know was my secret, meticulously documented scientific journals proving the farm's consistent profitability and future heritage value worth over $1 million. Hidden cameras had captured Peter and Brenda's avaricious plotting their plans to fabricate evidence of my incompetence. My loyal lawyer and community organizer allies were waiting in the wings. This time, their insidious fraud wouldn't just unravel. It would expose their shocking lack of humanity, reclaim my land, and secure my legacy, proving that truth triumphs over greed. The family meeting was supposed to discuss our holiday plans. I'd prepared refreshments, set the table with my grandmother's china, and looked forward to spending time with my children and grandchildren. The farmhouse kitchen where I'd raised 3 children and shared countless meals with my late husband Arthur felt warm and welcoming as everyone gathered around the oak table he'd built with his own hands. But the moment Peter walked through the door, I sensed something was wrong. His face was hard, his eyes calculating, and he carried himself with the aggressive posture of someone preparing for battle. Brenda, his wife, followed close behind her expression, smug and predatory. Mark and Sarah exchanged uncomfortable glances, their body language suggesting they knew what was coming. "Mom, we need to talk," Peter announced, not bothering with pleasantries or even acknowledging the meal I'd prepared. "About this farm, about your future, about reality." I felt my stomach drop as he pulled out a folder of documents and spread them across my kitchen table, covering the place settings I'd so carefully arranged. "I'm in debt, Mom. $500,000. My business ventures failed, and I need cash immediately. The solution is obvious: sell this farm." The casual way he said it, as if my life's work was nothing more than a commodity to be liquidated, left me speechless. This farm wasn't just property. It was 40 years of backbreaking labor, scientific innovation, and careful stewardship. It was where Arthur and I had built our life together, where we'd raised our children, where every acre told a story of love and dedication. "Peter," I said, my voice shaking with emotion, This farm isn't just real estate, it's our family's heritage. It's worth $2.5 million, yes, but more than that, it's profitable, sustainable, and represents decades of scientific research. I've transformed this land into something special, something that could provide for our family for generations. Peter's face twisted with impatience and something darker, contempt. Mom, this farm is dead weight. It's a gold mine that's just sitting here while I'm drowning in debt. You're too old to understand real business. You live in the past clinging to dirt and outdated farming methods. Sell it now. My debt depends on it. His voice rose to a shout that echoed through the kitchen, where I'd comforted him through childhood nightmares and celebrated his achievements. If you refuse, you're crazy, and you're no longer welcome in my life. You have no humanity for our future. Brenda, who'd been silent until now, spoke up with a chillingly condescending smirk. Honestly, Ellen, clinging to dirt, it's pathetic. Arthur would want us to be comfortable, not stuck on some dusty farm. Your sentimentality is a burden, and frankly, you're losing your mind if you think this place is worth keeping. The casual way she invoked my deceased husband's name, as if she could speak for him, as if she understood what he would have wanted, felt like a knife to my heart. Arthur had loved this farm as much as I did. He'd poured his soul into every furrow, every fence post, every improvement we'd made together. Arthur and I built this together. I said, my voice breaking. We researched sustainable farming methods. We implemented cutting-edge agricultural science. We increased the soil quality by 300%. This farm produces consistent profits, supports the local ecosystem, and has the potential to be worth over $1 million more in the coming years based on my research projections. But Peter wasn't listening. He'd already moved on to intimidation tactics, spreading legal documents across my table. I've already consulted with lawyers, Mom. If you're declared mentally incompetent to manage your affairs, I can force this sale. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. And I looked desperately to Mark and Sarah, hoping my other children would defend me, would remember the values I'd taught them, would stand up for their mother and their heritage. But Mark avoided my eyes entirely, staring down at his hands, as if the fate of our family farm was none of his concern. Sarah finally spoke, but her words offered no comfort. Mom, please don't fight this. It'll just make things worse for everyone. We all need the money. Maybe it's time to let go. The betrayal cut deeper than Peter's cruelty. At least he was being honest about his greed. Mark and Sarah were abandoning me while pretending it was for my own good, as if my 40 years of sacrifice and expertise meant nothing compared to their desire for easy money. But the cruelest blow came from my grandson, Ethan Mark's 17-year-old son. The boy I'd taught to plant seeds, to respect the land, to understand the science behind sustainable agriculture, looked at me with teenage disdain and laughed dismissively. Grandma, your farm smells like cows. Get real, sell it, and buy something cool. You're losing your mind, you old fool. Who wants to live around all this dirt and animal waste? The words hit me like physical blows. This child whose college fund I'd contributed to, whose summers I'd made magical, with farm adventures and hands-on science lessons, was now ridiculing everything I'd worked to preserve for his generation. As if Peter's personal assault wasn't enough, he'd brought legal firepower. Mr. Davies, a corporate lawyer known for his aggressive tactics, had apparently been consulted before this family meeting ever took place. The papers Peter spread across my table weren't suggestions. They were ultimatums backed by legal threats. Mrs. Patterson. Davies's voice crackled through Peter's phone on speaker, his tone professionally menacing. I want you to understand the serious legal implications if you resist this sale. Your son has legitimate concerns about your mental competency, and we have several options for proceeding with or without your cooperation. The humiliation was complete and systematic. This wasn't a family discussion. It was an ambush carefully planned and executed to overwhelm me with legal pressure, family guilt, and social isolation. Over the following weeks, Peter and Brenda escalated their campaign to force the sale. They began bringing potential buyers onto my property without my permission, parading them through my fields and barns while I was trying to work. They would point out improvements that could be made, discussing the land's commercial potential, as if I were deaf or invisible. This barn could be converted into an event venue. I heard Brenda tell a developer as they stood just outside my kitchen window. The farmhouse has rustic charm that people pay premium prices for. We're thinking wedding destination, corporate retreats, that sort of thing. They spread rumors throughout our small agricultural community that I was mentally incompetent and too old to manage the farm properly. Neighbors who'd known me for decades began looking at me with pity and suspicion, wondering if perhaps Peter was right about my declining capabilities. My calls to Mark and Sarah were met with increasing silence. When they did answer, they spoke to me like I was a confused elderly woman who needed to be managed rather than their mother who'd sacrificed everything for their well-being. "Mom, just consider Peter's proposal," Sarah would say in a tired voice. "You're 70 years old. How much longer can you really maintain a farm this size? Maybe it's time to simplify your life." But they didn't understand, couldn't understand, that this farm wasn't just my livelihood. It was my identity, my legacy, my life's work made manifest in healthy soil and thriving crops. Selling it wouldn't simplify my life, it would end it. As I stood in my fields that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky above land I'd nurtured for 40 years, I felt the weight of my isolation settling over me like a shroud. My own children had abandoned me. My grandson mocked me, and strangers were already planning how to destroy everything I'd built. But they had made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed I was just another confused elderly woman who would surrender without a fight. They'd forgotten that I was Ellen Patterson, agronomist, trained in the scientific method, skilled at observation and documentation, experienced in long-term planning and patient cultivation. Most importantly, they'd forgotten that anyone who could transform struggling farmland into a thriving agricultural enterprise understood something about persistence, about fighting for what matters, about never giving up when the stakes are this high. The harvest season was coming, and I intended to reap exactly what they had sown. The systematic assault on my autonomy escalated with frightening efficiency. Peter and Brenda no longer pretended this was about family concern or my well-being. They moved through my farm like conquerors, claiming territory, making decisions about my life and property as if I'd already ceased to exist. Peter arrived one morning with a briefcase full of legal documents and the insufferable confidence of someone who believed victory was assured. "Mom, we need to streamline your financial management," he announced, spreading papers across my kitchen table with the same casual authority he'd shown during the initial ambush. The documents were formal papers for power of attorney over my personal finances, my farm operations, and essentially every aspect of my life. The language was dense and intimidating, filled with legal terminology designed to confuse and overwhelm. But the intent was crystal clear. They wanted complete control over everything I owned. "You're clearly incapable of managing complex financial decisions," Peter explained with the patronizing patience of someone addressing a child. "This will protect you from making poor choices and ensure your assets are properly managed for everyone's benefit." The everyone he referred to obviously didn't include me. When I protested, when I pointed out that my farm had been consistently profitable under my management for 4 decades, when I mentioned my advanced degrees in agricultural science, Peter dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand. That was then, Mom. You're 70 years old now. Your judgment isn't what it used to be, and frankly, you're living in the past. Modern agriculture requires understanding markets, not just playing in the dirt. Meanwhile, Brenda had taken it upon herself to conduct unauthorized tours of my property for potential buyers. She would arrive with real estate agents and developers, leading them through my barns and fields, as if she already owned the place. The casual way she discussed converting my livestock facilities into rustic event spaces and my crop fields into luxury home sites felt like watching someone plan your funeral while you're still alive. This old farmhouse has so much potential, I heard her tell a group of investors as they stood in my front yard. With some updating, tear down these outdated farm buildings, modernize the house, maybe add a pool. This could be a premier rural estate. They spoke about my life's work as if it were an obstacle to be removed, an inconvenience standing in the way of their vision of profitable development. 40 years of sustainable farming, careful land management, and scientific research reduced to outdated farm buildings that needed to be demolished. But it was during one of these unauthorized tours that I overheard the conversation that shattered my last illusions about my family's motivations. I was in my study reviewing soil analysis reports when Brenda's voice carried clearly through the open window. "The old woman is becoming a real problem," she said to someone I couldn't see. "She keeps talking about her scientific methods and the farm's profitability, but nobody cares about that. Peter needs this money now, and she's standing in the way out of pure stubbornness." "What about the other children?" asked an unfamiliar male voice. "Mark and Sarah, they're weak. They'll go along with whatever we decide as long as they get their share. They don't have the spine to stand up to us, and they certainly don't have the backbone to defend their mother." The casual cruelty in her voice, the dismissive way she spoke about my life's work and my other children's character was devastating. But what came next was even worse. "Peter's already talking to lawyers about having her declared incompetent," Brenda continued. "Once we get control of her finances, we can force the sale and put her somewhere where she can't cause any more trouble. She's already 70. How many good years does she have left anyway?" As I listened to my son's wife planning my imprisonment with the efficiency of a business transaction, memories I'd tried to suppress came flooding back. Painful memories of sacrifices I'd made, secrets I'd kept, choices that had shaped all our lives in ways my children would never understand. The most devastating memory was from 25 years ago, during the worst drought in our county's recorded history. The farm was failing. We were facing bankruptcy, and Mark, then in his early 20s, was planning to leave agriculture entirely for opportunities in the city. He'd been accepted to a prestigious graduate program in business, but we couldn't afford the tuition, and he was using our financial crisis as justification for abandoning the family land. What Mark didn't know, what none of my children knew, was that I'd inherited a separate parcel of undeveloped land from my grandmother worth over $500,000. It was my retirement security, my insurance against disaster, my safety net for old age. I'd planned to keep it untouched, a financial cushion for my later years. But watching Mark prepare to leave, seeing the farm that Arthur and I had built together facing destruction, I made a choice that would haunt me for decades. I secretly sold that land, using every penny to save the farm and fund Mark's education. I told him the money came from a loan from insurance, from anywhere but the truth. I worked grueling 18-hour days for years, taking no salary, living on the bare minimum, slowly rebuilding what the drought had destroyed. I used cutting-edge agricultural science to transform our struggling farm into a model of sustainable profitability, but I never told my children the true cost of their opportunities. The cosmic irony was unbearable. The son I'd bankrupted myself to educate was now using that very education to argue for my incompetence. The farm I'd sacrificed my retirement to save was being used as justification for my imprisonment. When I tried to hint at these sacrifices during our next family confrontation, Peter's reaction was swift and brutal. "Mom, you're always playing the martyr." He snapped, his voice filled with exasperation and contempt. "Your past choices are your own business. You don't get to hold them over our heads forever. We didn't ask you to make those sacrifices, and they don't create any obligation on our part." Brenda nodded approvingly, adding her own cutting commentary. "Ellen, you're living in the past. We're looking to the future. Your sacrifices were your choice, not our burden. It's time to stop using guilt as a weapon and start making practical decisions." The casual dismissal of my life's devotion, the reduction of my sacrifices to guilt as a weapon, felt like being slapped repeatedly. But what hurt even more was Mark and Sarah's silence. They stood there, knowing I'd given up everything for their opportunities, and said nothing in my defense. Their silence was more devastating than Peter's cruelty, because it revealed the complete moral collapse of the family I'd tried so hard to nurture. They weren't just allowing my destruction. They were complicit in it, choosing financial gain over filial duty, convenience over conscience. The solution Peter presented was as insulting as it was exploitative. Through Mr. Davies, he offered me a settlement that would strip me of everything while making him appear generous. If I voluntarily agreed to sell the farm and accept him as my legal guardian, they would ensure I received quality care at Evergreen Sanctuary, an assisted living facility that cost $10,000 per month. The math was designed to be impossible. The farm would sell for $2.5 million, minus Peter's $500,000 debt, minus legal fees, minus management costs for handling my affairs. After paying for my care, there would be virtually nothing left, and what remained would be under Peter's control as my guardian. "This is really the best outcome for everyone," Mr. Davies explained during our phone consultation, his voice carrying the false sympathy of a predator. "You'll receive professional care appropriate for your age, and condition your family will be relieved of the burden of managing your complex affairs, and everyone can move forward with dignity." The word dignity, coming from someone planning my financial and personal destruction, was almost laughable. There was no dignity in being stripped of my life's work, imprisoned in an institution, and treated like a burden to be warehoused until death. But as I sat in my farmhouse that night, surrounded by 40 years of memories and achievements, I realized that my family had made a crucial error in their calculations. They'd assumed I was just another elderly woman who would surrender quietly to their demands. They'd forgotten that I was Ellen Patterson, agronomist, trained in the scientific method, skilled at long-term observation and careful documentation. Most importantly, they'd forgotten that anyone who could transform failing farmland into a thriving agricultural enterprise understood something about patience, persistence, and the power of careful preparation. They'd been so focused on their immediate greed that they'd overlooked the fact that I'd been documenting everything, every conversation, every threat, every unauthorized entry onto my property. The harvest was coming, and this time, they would reap exactly what they had sown. The morning they came to take me from my farm, I was in my greenhouse, tending to the seedlings I'd been nurturing for next season's planting. It was a beautiful March day, the kind that promised spring and renewal, the kind that had always filled me with hope for the future. I should have known that something so peaceful couldn't last. The vehicles arrived at precisely 9 o'clock. Peter's truck, followed by a white van from Evergreen Sanctuary, and a black sedan that undoubtedly contained Mr. Davies or one of his associates. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of people executing a well-rehearsed plan. Peter entered my greenhouse without knocking, his face set with grim determination. Behind him came 2 staff members from the assisted living facility, their uniforms crisp and their expressions professionally sympathetic. Mark and Sarah trailed behind, their faces pale and their eyes avoiding mine. "It's time, Mom," Peter announced, his voice carrying the finality of an executioner. "The facility is expecting you, and we need to make this transition as smooth as possible for everyone involved." I looked at these strangers and family members who'd come to remove me from the life I'd spent decades building. "I haven't agreed to this," I said, my voice steady, despite the fear rising in my chest. "This is my home. This is my farm. These are my choices to make." "Your choices." Peter laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Mom, you lost the right to make choices when you proved you couldn't make rational decisions. We're doing this for your own good, whether you understand it or not." One of the facility staff members stepped forward with a clipboard and a gentle but firm manner. "Mrs. Patterson, your family has arranged for your care due to concerns about your ability to manage independently. We're here to help you transition to a safer environment." But I'd never signed any documents authorizing this transfer. I'd never agreed to any care arrangement. Yet here they were, moving through my home like an efficient machine, boxing up my belongings with the casual indifference of professional movers. They deemed my scientific journals unnecessary paperwork and packed them for storage. My collection of antique farming tools, some dating back to my grandfather's time, were too bulky for my new living space. My carefully preserved seed packets, representing decades of research into heirloom varieties and sustainable agriculture, were clutter that needed to be discarded. "Mark, please," I called out as my eldest son supervised the systematic dismantling of my life. "Don't let them do this. This is our farm. This is your heritage. You know my mind is clear. You know what this place means to our family." Mark's face crumpled with emotion, and for a moment, I thought I'd reached him. He opened his mouth as if to speak, took a step toward Peter, but then his shoulders sagged in defeat. He turned away from me, unable to meet my eyes, his silence more devastating than any words could have been. "Sarah," I pleaded with my daughter, "you understand what this farm means. You spent your childhood here. You learned to appreciate the land, to respect the science behind sustainable agriculture. Please, don't let them destroy everything we've built." Sarah's face was streaked with tears, but she remained frozen in place, torn between family loyalty and moral courage. Her silence, like Mark's, spoke volumes about the choice she'd made between her conscience and her inheritance. As they prepared to take me away, Peter's cold indifference reached new depths of cruelty. "Just get her settled quickly," he told the facility staff, as if I were cargo to be delivered, rather than his mother being torn from her home. "And make sure you take her phone. She won't need it where she's going, and frankly, she's been making too many calls to people who don't need to be involved in family business." Brenda, who'd been orchestrating the removal of my personal belongings, approached with her trademark, condescending smile. "Honestly, Ellen, this farm is far too much for you now. You should think of this as a fresh start, a chance to relax and let other people handle the complicated stuff. Your new place will be paid for with your own money, so really you should be grateful. But the cruelest blow came from my grandson, Ethan, who'd been watching the proceedings with the detached interest of someone observing a mildly entertaining show. When I made one final attempt to reach him, to remind him of the summers we'd spent together learning about agriculture and environmental science, his response was devastating. "Grandma, your farm smells like cows, and it's boring," he said with the casual cruelty that only teenagers can muster. "You're crazy if you think anyone wants to keep living like this. Why don't you just die already so we can all move on with our lives?" The words hung in the air like poison. This child whose college fund I'd contributed, to whose environmental science projects I'd helped with, whose future I'd tried to secure through careful land stewardship, had just wished for my death. The ride to Evergreen Sanctuary was a blur of unfamiliar highway and devastating silence. When we arrived, the facility was exactly what I'd feared: institutional, sterile, designed for efficiency rather than human dignity. My room was small, with a narrow bed, a single chair, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. Peter's farewell was brief and businesslike. "The staff will take good care of you, Mom. Try to make the best of it." He left without looking back, without a hug, without any acknowledgement that he was abandoning his mother to die among strangers. That night, alone in my sterile room, wearing institutional clothing, staring out at the empty parking lot where my beloved farm field should have been, I broke down completely. The tears came in waves, great heaving sobs that shook my entire body. I'd lost everything: my home, my life's work, my independence, my family. But as I sat there in the darkness, the most painful memory of all surfaced. The secret I'd carried for over 20 years, the sacrifice that made Peter's betrayal so cosmically cruel. After Arthur died, when the children were young adults, finding their paths in life, I'd been offered the opportunity of a lifetime. The International Agricultural Research Institute had selected me for a prestigious grant worth millions in funding and global recognition. It was a 3-year project studying sustainable farming practices in developing countries' work that would have established me as a world-renowned expert in my field. The position would have meant traveling extensively, conducting groundbreaking research, and achieving the kind of professional recognition that most scientists only dream of. It was everything I'd worked toward, the culmination of decades of study and practical experience. But Peter, then in his early 20s, and still struggling with the emotional aftermath of his father's death, couldn't handle the idea of his mother leaving for extended periods. He was dealing with anxiety and depression, and the thought of losing another parent, even temporarily, sent him into a panic. "I can't cope with you being gone, Mom," he'd pleaded with me through his tears. "I know it's selfish, but I need you here. I need stability, not more change. I need to know you're here if I need you." So I'd made the choice I'd made 1,000 times before I chose my child over myself. I turned down the grant, told the Institute I wasn't ready for such a commitment, and watched my professional dreams disappear to protect my son's emotional well-being. I'd given up international recognition, groundbreaking research, and a legacy that would have lasted far beyond my lifetime. I'd sacrificed my deepest professional aspirations for Peter's perceived emotional security, just as I'd sacrificed my financial security for Mark's education. And now, 20 years later, that same son was calling me incompetent while stealing my farm. The boy I'd protected from his own fragility was now using my love as a weapon against me, confident that I was too broken to fight back. The cosmic irony was almost too much to bear. I'd spent my career creating abundance from the soil nurturing growth, building something sustainable and beautiful. But my own family had created nothing but destruction, using my sacrifices as justification for their cruelty. As dawn broke over the parking lot outside my window, I made a decision. I was Ellen Patterson, agronomist, and I had never backed down from a challenge that required patience, persistence, and scientific precision. This time, the problem I needed to solve was my own family's corruption, and the solution would require everything I'd learned about careful observation, detailed documentation, and long-term planning. They thought they'd buried me in this institutional grave, but they'd forgotten that anyone who could make a barren field flourish understood something about resurrection, about fighting impossible odds, about never giving up when the stakes were this high. The harvest season was coming, and this time I intended to reap justice. Life at Evergreen Sanctuary was designed to strip away every vestige of individual identity and replace it with institutional compliance. I was no longer Ellen Patterson, respected agronomist and farm owner. I was resident 347 Wing C, a problem to be managed with minimal effort and maximum profit. The psychological assault began immediately. The staff had been thoroughly briefed about my condition by Peter and Brenda, who'd provided them with carefully crafted reports about my declining mental state and dangerous obsession with outdated farming practices. My 40 years of scientific expertise were dismissed as delusions about dirt, and any attempt I made to discuss sustainable agriculture was met with condescending smiles and clipboard notations. "Now, Ellen," a nurse would say when I tried to explain the importance of crop rotation, "you're a resident here, not a scientist. Those kinds of complicated thoughts just upset you. Why don't we focus on something more appropriate for your situation?" My attempts to discuss soil health, environmental sustainability, or the scientific methods I'd spent decades perfecting were labeled as agitation and noted in my file as evidence of my mental deterioration. The intellectual stimulation that had defined my entire adult life was systematically removed, replaced with adult coloring books and daytime television programming designed for people with cognitive impairment. But the staff weren't acting independently. Peter and Brenda had been making generous donations to Evergreen Sanctuary, along with providing regular progress reports about my supposed decline. These reports painted me as increasingly confused, potentially violent, and completely unable to manage my own affairs. The family is so concerned about her safety. I overheard the head nurse telling a colleague. Her son says she becomes agitated when people question her farming fantasies. We need to be very careful not to encourage her delusions about being some kind of agricultural expert. The cruelest torture came during Ethan's supervised visits. Peter and Brenda would bring my grandson every few weeks, but these weren't the loving family interactions I'd once cherished. They were carefully orchestrated performances designed to reinforce the narrative of my mental decline. "Grandma, do you remember who I am?" Ethan would ask, his voice coached to sound concerned and patient. When I responded with detailed memories of our time together, of the scientific projects we'd worked on, of the environmental lessons I'd taught him, the adults would exchange knowing glances as if my memories were fabrications. They brought me comfort items that felt like insults, large print children's books, about farming adult coloring books, featuring simple pictures of flowers and puzzles with only 12 pieces. Each gift was designed to reinforce their narrative that I was no longer capable of complex thought or meaningful activity. But the most devastating visit came when Ethan showed me a photograph on his phone. It was a picture of him and Peter standing on what had once been my most productive cornfield, both holding a bright red "sold" sign. Behind them, I could see bulldozers beginning to clear the land I'd spent decades nurturing. "Dad says you don't need this anymore, Grandma," Ethan explained with the casual cruelty that only children can muster. "He says it's better this way because you were getting too confused to take care of it properly." The image felt like a knife to my heart, not just because my farm was being destroyed, but because my own grandson had been turned into a weapon against me, used to deliver news of my life's work being obliterated while I sat powerless to stop it. The destruction was being celebrated publicly. Brenda's social media posts documented every step of the farm's transformation from agricultural land to commercial development. She posted before and after renderings showing my carefully cultivated fields replaced by strip malls and parking lots. "So excited about Peter's vision for maximizing this property's potential," she wrote. "Sometimes you have to move beyond sentimental attachments to embrace profitable opportunities. The old farming methods were quaint, but this land can serve so many more people as a commercial center." The comments section filled with praise for Peter's business acumen and Brenda's practical wisdom. No one mentioned the decades of sustainable farming research that was being bulldozed, the heirloom seed varieties that were being destroyed, the ecological systems that were being dismantled for profit. My financial destruction was equally systematic. I learned that my personal bank accounts had been transferred entirely to Peter's control under his guardianship authority. My pension payments from the university were automatically diverted to pay for my care, though the facility's monthly fees consumed far more than my pension provided. When I tried to access my own funds or contact my former lawyer, I was met with bureaucratic stonewalling. The facility claimed they couldn't assist residents with complex financial matters, while Mr. Davies informed me that all communication needed to go through Peter as my legal guardian. "I'm afraid your mother's condition makes direct communication inadvisable," I heard him tell someone on the phone. "Her family is handling all her affairs now, and frankly, she's not competent to make financial decisions." The isolation was complete and methodical. I was cut off from my money, my property, my professional network, and my family. The staff discussed me as if I were deaf or completely senile, referring to me as a high-maintenance resident whose family never visits, except for those brief supervised encounters designed to document my supposed decline. But in my darkest moment, when I felt myself disappearing entirely into the gray institutional landscape of Evergreen Sanctuary, something unexpected happened. Maria, a young nursing assistant who'd always been kind to me, slipped something into my hand during her evening rounds. "I found this in the belongings they brought from your house," she whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "I thought you might want to keep it." It was a small, worn seed packet from my collection, one that had somehow escaped the systematic disposal of my life's work. As I examined it in the dim light of my room, I noticed something that made my heart race, a tiny inscription in faded ink that read, "Eleanor's Help." Eleanor Jenkins was my neighbor, a retired teacher who'd been my closest friend for over a decade. She'd witnessed my dedication to the farm, my scientific research, my constant care for the land. If anyone knew the truth about my competence and the value of what I'd built, it was Eleanor. The seed packet reminded me that I wasn't completely alone, that there were people outside these walls who knew the real Ellen Patterson. More importantly, it reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten in my despair: the hidden cameras I'd installed around my property months ago, triggered by my growing suspicion of Peter and Brenda's intentions. If Eleanor had access to those recordings, if she'd been watching and documenting what had been done to me, then perhaps there was still hope. Perhaps the truth about my family's betrayal was being preserved by someone who understood its importance. As I held that tiny seed packet in my trembling hands, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months' determination. I was Ellen Patterson, agronomist, trained in the scientific method, skilled at patient observation and careful documentation. I'd spent my career understanding how things grow, how they survive adverse conditions, how they find ways to thrive, even in hostile environments. They thought they'd buried me in this institutional soil, but they'd forgotten that seeds can survive the harshest winters and emerge stronger in the spring. My time for growth was coming, and when it arrived, the harvest would be more abundant than they could imagine. The invitation that would complete my professional destruction arrived at Evergreen Sanctuary in a manila envelope marked educational materials. A staff member, thinking it was some kind of therapeutic literature, nearly discarded it before I convinced her to let me see it. National Agricultural Innovation Conference, the glossy brochure announced, and there listed as the keynote speaker was Peter Patterson, visionary land developer and agricultural modernization expert. My son was going to speak at a national conference about agriculture. My son, who'd never planted a seed or analyzed soil composition, who'd spent his childhood complaining about farm chores and dreaming of life in the city. I stared at the promotional materials, my hands shaking as I read the description of Peter's presentation, From Stagnation to Success, Modernizing Agricultural Land Use for Maximum Profitability. The abstract described how Peter had courageously transformed our family farm's outdated production methods into a dynamic commercial venture that maximizes land value. He was going to use my farm, my research, my life's work as an example of everything wrong with traditional agriculture. He was going to present the destruction of my sustainable farming practices as a success story in modern land development. The conference was being held at the Grand Convention Center, the same venue where I'd presented my research on soil conservation just 3 years earlier, the same stage where I'd been honored by the American Society of Agronomy for my innovative approaches to sustainable farming and my exceptional contributions to environmental stewardship. Now my son was going to take my place at that podium, using my scientific data to justify the obliteration of everything I'd accomplished. A sympathetic staff member at Evergreen Sanctuary helped me access the conference's live stream on her tablet. I sat in my wheelchair in the corner of the common room wearing headphones so I wouldn't disturb the other residents watching my professional legacy being systematically dismantled. Peter took the stage wearing a perfectly tailored suit, his confidence radiating through the screen. Behind him, a large display showed a slide titled Case Study When Tradition Becomes Obstacle. Sometimes, Peter began his voice, carrying the authority of someone who'd stolen my expertise and claimed it as his own. Agricultural land becomes trapped by outdated practices that no longer serve economic reality. My family's farm had been managed using methods from the previous century, resulting in stagnation and missed opportunities. He clicked to the next slide, showing my carefully documented productivity data, information he'd obtained from my confiscated research journals. But the numbers had been manipulated selectively, edited to show declining yields and inefficient resource use. The previous management focused on so-called sustainable practices that actually limited profitability. Peter continued. Crop rotation schedules that left land unused, organic methods that reduced yields, and an obsessive attachment to heirloom varieties that had no commercial value. Every word was a lie built on stolen truth. Peter was using my terminology, my data, my decades of research to justify his destruction of everything I'd built. He'd appropriated my life's work and twisted it into a weapon against me. The audience was captivated. Here was a visionary who'd had the courage to modernize his family's agricultural operation despite resistance from traditional thinking. Here was a success story about prioritizing economic reality over sentimental attachment to outdated methods. The breakthrough came when we recognized that the land's highest and best use wasn't agriculture at all, Peter announced. By converting the property to commercial development, we increased its value by over 300% while serving the community's actual needs. Brenda appeared on screen for a panel discussion on family dynamics in land use optimization. She looked poised and professional, the perfect image of a supportive wife who'd helped her husband overcome family obstacles to achieve success. It wasn't easy watching Peter struggle with his mother's resistance to change. Brenda said, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. She had such beautiful intentions, but her inability to adapt to modern realities was preventing the family from achieving financial security. Peter showed incredible courage in choosing economic viability over outdated sentimentality. The audience gave them a standing ovation. I watched through tears as my daughter-in-law, the woman who'd stolen my home and destroyed my life's work, was celebrated as a victim of my inflexibility. The most devastating moment came when they showed a pre-recorded video message from Ethan. My 12-year-old grandson looked directly into the camera, his face serious and mature beyond his years. "I've learned that you have to think about business, not just feelings," he said. "My grandmother's old farming methods might have been interesting, but they weren't practical. I'm grateful for my dad's vision in turning our land into something that actually helps people and makes money." The words were clearly scripted, probably rehearsed dozens of times, but they came from my grandson's mouth. The boy I'd taught to understand soil science, whose environmental awareness I'd nurtured through hands-on learning, was now publicly endorsing the destruction of everything I'd taught him. Then came the video clip that made the audience laugh and nod knowingly. Chloe, my 10-year-old granddaughter, was shown holding up one of my carefully preserved soil samples, giggling as she said, "Grandma used to dig in this dirty stuff. So gross, we prefer digital farming. That's actually clean." The audience laughed at the generational divide, at the old-fashioned grandmother clinging to obsolete methods, while her progressive family embraced new approaches to land use. My life's work was being presented as a cautionary tale of scientific stagnation and professional irrelevance. As the conference concluded, with Peter receiving an award for innovation in land use optimization, I sat in that wheelchair, feeling like I'd watched my own professional funeral. My reputation, built over 40 years of dedicated research, had been systematically destroyed by people who'd stolen my data, my property, and now my legacy. But as I prepared to wheel myself back to my room, the staff member who'd helped me watch the stream touched my shoulder gently. "Mrs. Patterson," she said quietly, "there's someone here who wants to speak with you." I looked up to see Dr. Margaret Chen, my former colleague from the university, and one of the most respected environmental scientists in the country. Her face was flushed with anger, her eyes bright with the kind of righteous fury I hadn't seen in months. "Ellen," she said, kneeling beside my wheelchair, "I've been watching that conference, and I've been investigating what your family has done to you. What Peter is claiming about your research is complete fiction. I have your original data, your peer-reviewed publications documentation of everything you actually accomplished." For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. Margaret had found proof of what I'd known all along. Peter's presentation was built on lies, distortions, and stolen expertise. They think they've won, Margaret continued, but they've made one crucial mistake. They've been so focused on destroying your reputation that they've created a trail of evidence that will expose their entire scheme. Your real research, your actual accomplishments, your legitimate scientific contributions. All of it is documented and preserved. As I looked at my colleague at the documents she'd brought at the proof of my actual professional achievements laid bare in black and white, I realized that my scientific training hadn't failed me. I'd been so overwhelmed by my personal trauma that I'd forgotten my expertise as a researcher and educator. I was Ellen Patterson agronomist, and I'd spent 40 years learning to distinguish between genuine growth and invasive species, between sustainable practices and exploitative ones. Now it was time to use that knowledge to expose the parasites that had been feeding on my life's work. The lawsuit papers arrived at Evergreen Sanctuary on a Monday morning, delivered by a courier who looked embarrassed to be serving legal documents to a woman in a wheelchair wearing institutional clothing. The letterhead was imposing Davies, Richardson, and Associates, and the document was thick, official, and devastating. Peter was suing me for $1 million. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal manipulation, claiming that my harassment and defamation had caused him severe emotional distress and irreparable damage to his professional reputation. It alleged that my persistent attempts to interfere with his legitimate business ventures constituted stalking, and that my false accusations about family financial matters had damaged his ability to conduct business effectively. Every claim was a twisted version of reality. My attempts to contact my family became harassment. My efforts to understand what had happened to my farm became defamation. My fight for basic respect became stalking. The legal system was being weaponized against me by people who understood exactly how to manipulate it. But Peter wasn't finished with his systematic destruction of my life. Within days of filing the lawsuit, he began a coordinated campaign to eliminate what little financial security I had left. He contacted my former university and agricultural associations with fabricated concerns about my mental competence and erratic behavior during my final years of research. The accusations were vague, but damaging claims that I'd shown signs of cognitive decline during my last conference presentations, that I'd been financially irresponsible with research grants, that my increasingly unstable behavior had created liability concerns for the institution. Dr. Harrison, a psychiatrist who'd never examined me, but who'd been paid to write a report based on Peter's descriptions of my paranoid delusions, provided professional testimony about my alleged incompetence. The university board, terrified of potential lawsuits and lacking any way to verify Peter's claims, voted to revoke my pension and remove my name from their research center. 40 years of groundbreaking research, dozens of published papers, countless contributions to sustainable agriculture, and it was all erased by lies and fear. The pension that was supposed to sustain me through my final years was gone stolen through legal manipulation, disguised as protective action. My professional associations received similar calls. Peter claimed I'd been making erratic statements about family matters and expressing confusion about my past research. He provided them with legal documents suggesting I was incompetent to represent their organization's documents that had been prepared using carefully edited excerpts from my desperate attempts to maintain contact with my family. Within 12 weeks, I was completely destitute. The lawsuit had consumed what little money I could access through the facility's restricted account system. My pension was gone. My professional honors had been revoked. My scientific legacy had been erased from the institutions I'd served for decades. The final humiliation came when Evergreen Sanctuary informed me that my family funding had been discontinued due to my legal troubles. Without any source of payment, I couldn't remain even in this minimal level of care. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson," the facility director said, her voice professionally sympathetic. "Your family has indicated they can no longer support your residency here due to your ongoing legal difficulties. We'll need to arrange alternative care within 72 hours. Alternative care meant the streets. At 70 years old, disabled by months of institutional neglect and systematic abuse, I was being cast out to die among strangers. Mark and Sarah had already made their position clear in statements to the local newspaper. "We have no legal or moral obligation to support someone who has consistently made false accusations against our family," Mark was quoted as saying. "Our mother's choices have consequences, and we won't enable her destructive behavior by continuing to fund her care." Sarah's response was even more cutting. She posted on social media, "Some people create their own problems and then expect others to fix them. I have my own family to worry about. Prayers for wisdom and peace for everyone involved." The message was clear. I was on my own, abandoned by the children I'd raised, left to die on the streets by people who claimed their actions were motivated by love. But Peter and Brenda weren't content with just destroying me. They wanted to celebrate their victory, to display their spoils, to show the world what they'd accomplished with my stolen legacy. 6 months after my eviction from the facility, Brenda posted photos on social media of their new Smart Farm demonstration center, a luxury facility that had cost over $300,000 of my farm's sale proceeds. The center featured state-of-the-art equipment, digital monitoring systems, and educational displays about modern agricultural efficiency. "So grateful to dedicate this beautiful facility to Peter's visionary work in agricultural innovation," she wrote. "This center represents his talent and foresight in maximizing land value while serving the community. His mother would be proud of the positive impact he's having on modern farming education." She'd used my stolen life's work to build a monument to Peter's destruction of everything I'd believed in. The demonstration center was a shrine to my professional death, built with the money from the farm I'd spent 40 years developing. The photos were shared widely, with comments pouring in from agricultural professionals and community members praising Peter's success and vision. What a beautiful tribute to agricultural innovation. So inspiring to see someone turn land into community benefit. This is what real agricultural leadership looks like. No one asked where the expertise had come from. No one questioned how someone with no agricultural background could suddenly become an innovation expert. No one wondered about the mother who disappeared from his life just as his reputation had flourished. The stress of my situation was destroying what remained of my health. I'd lost 60 pounds since being forced from my home. My blood pressure was dangerously elevated, and I was developing a persistent tremor that made simple tasks nearly impossible. I was living in a downtown homeless shelter, sharing a dormitory with women decades younger than me, surviving on one meal a day from charity organizations. Then one night, sleeping on a cot surrounded by strangers, I collapsed. The stroke was severe, what doctors called a major cerebrovascular event. I was rushed to the county hospital emergency room where machines kept me alive while my body fought to survive. For 8 days, I drifted in and out of consciousness, unsure whether I wanted to wake up or simply slip away into peace. But in those fevered dreams, I remembered something that had been buried for over 30 years. I was back at an environmental conference in 1992, engaged in a heated debate about sustainable land use versus commercial development. A young man, arrogant and dismissive, had argued that environmental concerns were obstacles to economic progress. Land is a resource to be maximized, he'd declared. All this talk about sustainability and ecological balance is just romantic nonsense that prevents rational economic development. I'd fought back presenting data about soil depletion, environmental damage, and the long-term costs of unsustainable practices. But the young man had dismissed my concerns with exactly the same arguments Peter was now using to justify destroying my farm. The dream was so vivid that I could hear the applause when I'd finally demolished his arguments with scientific evidence. And I realized with startling clarity that my entire career had been spent fighting against exactly the kind of destructive thinking that my own son was now embodying. But I also realized something else. I wasn't just Ellen Patterson, the victim of my family's greed. I was Ellen Patterson, the agronomist, who'd spent 40 years learning to recognize and combat exactly this kind of environmental and scientific destruction. As I lay in that hospital bed, barely alive but finally awake, I understood that my professional training hadn't failed me. I'd been so overwhelmed by my personal betrayal that I'd forgotten my expertise. I knew how to document evidence, how to build scientific cases, how to expose false claims, even when they were sophisticated and well-funded. Peter and Brenda had made one crucial mistake. They'd forgotten that I was trained to recognize exactly what they were doing. They'd also forgotten that I'd spent decades building a network of professional allies who understood the importance of protecting scientific integrity from fraudulent exploitation. The growing season wasn't over. In fact, the most important harvest was about to begin, and this time I would be reaping truth. From my hospital bed, still weak from the stroke, but driven by a clarity that burned brighter than my physical pain, I knew I had one chance to reach my remaining children. The recovered memory of that long ago environmental debate had given me insight into the destructive patterns that were consuming our family, and I needed Mark and Sarah to understand what Peter's choices were really costing us all. My nurse Jennifer was a kind woman in her 40s who'd been moved by my story. "Mrs. Patterson," she said quietly during her night shift, "I've seen families destroy each other over money and land, but what they're doing to you is different. This is systematic. This is calculated abuse." I asked Jennifer to help me record a video message on her phone. I wanted to speak directly to Mark and Sarah to bypass Peter and Brenda's influence, to appeal to whatever remained of the children I'd raised, to respect the land and understand the value of scientific truth. Mark, Sarah. I began looking directly into the camera, my voice hoarse but determined. I need you to hear this from me, not filtered through Peter and Brenda's lies. I want you to understand what's happening to our family, to recognize the patterns that are destroying everything we once valued. I told them about the recovered memories that had surfaced during my medical crisis, the way Peter's destructive approach to land use mirrored the very practices I'd spent my career fighting against. I played the audio recordings I'd secretly made during that first family meeting, capturing Peter's callous demands and Brenda's calculating remarks about maximizing the farm's commercial value. "Listen to their voices," I said, playing back their words. "Listen to how they talk about our land when they think no one else is listening. Dead weight. Sitting there. Maximizing market value. This isn't stewardship, children. This is exploitation. This is exactly the kind of destructive thinking that turns living ecosystems into profit margins." I spoke about the sacrifices I'd made for them, not to guilt them, but to help them understand the depth of my commitment to sustainable practices and long-term thinking. I mentioned Peter's complete disregard for the ecological value of our farm, the way he dismissed 40 years of soil conservation and environmental research as worthless sentiment. I gave up the International Agricultural Research Grant for Peter's emotional security, I said. I sacrificed my own professional dreams to ensure he felt supported and loved, but I won't sacrifice the truth anymore. Peter's actions are following the same destructive patterns I fought against my entire career, and you're allowing him to destroy not just our family, but everything our land represents. I spoke for 25 minutes, laying bare the full scope of their betrayal, while also acknowledging my deep love for my children. I admitted my mistakes, my perhaps overly protective instincts, my role in keeping secrets that might have better served them if shared earlier. This is my final plea, I concluded, not as your victim, but as your mother, and as a scientist who understands what we're losing. I'm asking you to remember the values I taught you, the respect for the land that once guided our family, the difference between short-term profit and long-term sustainability. Jennifer promised to send the video directly to Mark and Sarah's phones, and I felt a fragile hope that maybe finally my remaining children would see what Peter had become and choose to stand up for what was right. But I'd underestimated Brenda's surveillance network at the hospital. She'd been paying staff members to monitor my communications, and she intercepted the video before Mark and Sarah ever saw it. What happened next was a masterpiece of digital manipulation that would have been brilliant if it hadn't been so evil. Brenda took my raw emotional plea and transformed it into something sinister. She used editing software to alter the audio, making my voice sound confused and rambling. She spliced sentences together to create statements I'd never made, particularly around my references to Peter's disregard for environmental principles. Most cruelly, she edited my discussion of Peter's destructive land use to make it sound like I was threatening to expose fictional environmental crimes. My plea for Mark and Sarah to remember the values I taught you became remember what you're hiding. My mention of fighting against destructive patterns my entire career became, I know what you've been doing to the environment. The doctored video was a work of art in its malicious creativity. It portrayed me as a dying woman making paranoid environmental accusations, a delusional patient trying to blackmail her own family, a bitter mother inventing ecological conspiracies to destroy her son's success. Brenda sold the manipulated video to Environmental Watch Today, a gossip program that specialized in sensational environmental scandals. They aired it as an exclusive expose, dying scientists' shocking environmental accusations against family. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within hours, the video had been shared millions of times across social media. Comments poured in, almost universally condemning me as a manipulative, mentally ill woman trying to destroy my family's legitimate business success. This is exactly why families need to set boundaries with toxic elderly relatives. One comment read, "Some seniors will say anything to get attention and control." "She sounds completely delusional," said another. "Thank God her son is strong enough to protect his business from these environmental conspiracy theories." "Mental illness in the elderly is so tragic," added a third. "But that doesn't excuse trying to destroy your own children's lives with false accusations." Mark and Sarah's response was swift and professionally managed. They appeared on the same Environmental Watch program, their faces drawn with carefully practiced grief, their voices trembling with emotion. "This breaks our hearts," Mark said, dabbing at his eyes with a tissue that seemed to appear at exactly the right moment. "Our mother has been struggling with paranoid delusions since her stroke. We've tried everything to help her, but she's convinced that everyone is involved in some kind of environmental conspiracy. Now she's making these terrible accusations about our family's legitimate business activities. The interviewer's questions were sympathetic, designed to paint Mark and Sarah as the long-suffering children of a mentally ill mother. How do you cope with these environmental conspiracy theories? We just try to remember that this isn't really our mother talking. Sarah replied, her voice breaking at precisely the right moment. This is her illness. The woman who raised us was a brilliant scientist, but this person making these accusations is someone we don't recognize. Ethan appeared on camera, my grandson, now 13, and poised in front of the cameras like a seasoned performer. I love my grandmother, Ethan said, his voice steady and mature. But her illness has changed her completely. She's not the scientist who taught me about farming. We just want her to get the help she needs so she can find some peace. The interviewer asked about my claims regarding Peter's land development practices, and Mark's response was devastating in its calculated vulnerability. Our mother is trying to weaponize environmental concerns to attack our family's business, he said. Yes, we developed agricultural land for commercial use. That's completely legal and beneficial to our community. But to suggest that there's something environmentally criminal about legitimate development is both cruel and dangerous. It undermines real environmental protection efforts. He'd turned my protection of environmental principles into my victimization of legitimate business. He'd transformed my scientific expertise into my conspiracy theories. He'd made himself and Peter the victims of my environmental extremism. The media coverage was overwhelming. Environmental experts were brought in to discuss conspiracy theories among elderly scientists. Legal analysts explained how families could protect themselves from false environmental accusations by mentally ill relatives. Agricultural professionals, people who should have recognized my legitimate concerns, discussed the tragic case of a woman whose illness had destroyed her relationship with her successful family. But in the midst of this media storm, something unexpected happened. Dr. Margaret Chen, my former colleague who'd been quietly supporting me, was watching the coverage from her office. She'd known me for over 20 years, had worked with me on countless research projects, and she recognized something that others missed: the systematic nature of my destruction. Margaret contacted Dr. Robert Hayes, a digital forensics expert who specialized in detecting manipulated media. Together, they brought in a retired environmental lawyer who'd investigated corporate fraud cases for decades. Within days, they had irrefutable proof that Brenda's video had been altered. The audio analysis showed clear signs of editing, the visual examination revealed digital manipulation, and the metadata proved that the video had been processed through sophisticated editing software. Dr. Hayes also expanded his investigation into Peter's land development deals, uncovering a pattern of environmental violations and fraudulent claims that extended beyond my farm. Soil reports, environmental impact studies, and testimony from other landowners painted a picture of a man who'd been systematically violating environmental regulations while positioning himself as an agricultural innovator. But I didn't know about their investigation yet. From my hospital bed, I watched my life's work, my reputation, and my final plea for environmental justice being twisted into a weapon against me. I saw my grandson publicly disavow me, my remaining children stand against me, and my son profit from my destruction. The nurse who'd helped me record the original message was suspended for violating patient privacy policies. The few staff members who'd shown me kindness were reassigned to different departments. I was more isolated than ever, surrounded by people who saw me as the delusional woman from the viral video. But as I lay there watching my reputation burn in the court of public opinion, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: perfect, terrible clarity. The fog of gaslighting was lifting, the confusion was clearing, and I could see the situation with the kind of understanding that only comes from hitting absolute bottom. Peter hadn't just returned to steal my farm. He'd come to finish what his greed had started, the complete annihilation of anyone who might hold him accountable for his environmental destruction. He'd used my own family as his weapons, my own love as his ammunition, my own scientific reputation as his shield. But he'd made one crucial mistake in his perfect plan. He'd forgotten that I was Ellen Patterson, agronomist, and I'd spent 40 years learning to recognize and fight exactly this kind of systematic environmental fraud. The growing season wasn't over. The final harvest was about to begin, and this time I would be cultivating truth. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Margaret Chen, my former colleague who'd been quietly investigating my case, discovered that I had a forgotten land trust account I'd established years ago for environmental research, money that had been earning interest for decades. It contained just enough to fund the legal battle of my lifetime. Ellen. Margaret said, visiting me in the hospital, "We're going to fight this with everything we have. I've assembled a team and we're going to expose what they've done to you and the land you loved." Within weeks, I had a legal team that Peter and Brenda never saw coming. Judge Catherine Morrison, a retired agricultural lawyer who specialized in family farm fraud. David Santos, a community organizer who'd fought corporate land grabs for decades. And Sarah Mitchell, an investigative journalist whose expose of elder abuse had won national awards. "We're not just fighting for your farm," Judge Morrison explained during our first strategy meeting. "We're fighting for every elderly person who's been victimized by their own family and every piece of agricultural land that's been stolen from its rightful stewards." The federal civil and criminal lawsuit we filed was comprehensive and devastating. Peter and Brenda were charged with elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy. The charges carried potential prison sentences and financial penalties that would strip them of everything they'd stolen from me. The media attention was immediate and intense. The case had everything journalists loved: family betrayal, stolen farmland viral videos, and a victim who'd fought back against impossible odds. Court TV announced they would broadcast the proceedings live, and agricultural experts began analyzing the case on national television. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when the trial began. Peter sat at the defendant's table, his usual confidence visibly shaken by the magnitude of the charges against him. Brenda sat beside him, no longer the composed manipulator, but a frightened woman facing federal prison. Mark and Sarah sat in the gallery, their faces pale with the realization of what they'd helped enable. Judge Morrison took the stand, first her presentation methodical and devastating. She'd spent months analyzing every land transfer document, every legal filing, every piece of evidence related to the systematic theft of my farm and destruction of my life. "The evidence is overwhelming," she said, her voice calm and professional. Peter and Brenda Patterson orchestrated a systematic campaign of elder abuse designed to isolate Ellen Patterson from her support network, steal her agricultural property, and destroy her reputation when she tried to resist. But the most damaging evidence came next. Sarah Mitchell played the unfiltered footage from my hidden cameras, the recordings Peter and Brenda thought no one would ever see. The courtroom fell silent as Peter's voice filled the space, cold and calculating. "The old woman is completely out of touch with reality. This farm is worth $2.5 million, and she wants to keep it for sentimental reasons. We need to get her declared incompetent before she ruins everything." Brenda's voice responded with chilling efficiency. "I've already talked to that psychiatrist. He'll write whatever report we need. Once we get control of her finances, we can force the sale and clear your $500,000 debt. The old lady won't be a problem much longer." The jury listened in stunned silence as the conspiracy unfolded in real time. But then the footage revealed something even more sinister: their plans to manipulate my grandchildren. "Ethan needs to start asking leading questions," Brenda's voice instructed. "Make her look confused, forgetful. Chloe should act scared of her, like she's becoming dangerous. We need documentation that she's not safe around children." The most chilling moment came when Brenda's voice turned truly vicious. "Honestly, if the old lady would just die already, this would all be so much easier. How much longer can she really live anyway? She's 70 and getting weaker every day." The courtroom erupted in murmurs of horror. The jury looked physically sick. Even the judge appeared shaken by the casual cruelty in their voices. When Peter was called to testify, his carefully constructed facade began to crumble immediately. Confronted with the video evidence, the financial records, and the testimony of expert witnesses, he tried desperately to explain away his actions. "I was trying to help her," he said, his voice shaking. "She was becoming confused, making poor decisions about the farm. Someone had to take responsibility for protecting the family's assets." But as the recordings played again, as the scope of his deception became clear, something inside Peter broke completely. He began to weep, then to shake, then to become completely incoherent. "I never meant for it to go this far." He sobbed, his words barely intelligible. "I just needed the money. The debts were crushing me, and the farm was just sitting there. I thought if I could just sell it, I could fix everything. But she kept fighting me, kept questioning everything, and I got so desperate." The transformation was complete. The manipulative predator who destroyed my life was reduced to a broken, crying figure on the witness stand. I felt no satisfaction in his collapse, only a profound sadness for the boy I'd raised and the man he'd chosen to become. Brenda's reaction was swift and desperate. She tried to flee the courtroom when she realized the case was lost, but court officers apprehended her before she could escape. Her carefully maintained composure crumbled into panic and rage. "This is all Peter's fault," she screamed as they restrained her. "He planned everything. I was just trying to support my husband. Ellen is vindictive. She's trying to destroy our family." But the evidence against her was overwhelming. The digital manipulation of my video, the systematic destruction of my reputation, the orchestrated campaign of isolation, all of it traced back to her planning and execution. Mr. Davies, the lawyer, who'd become complicit in their scheme, was facing his own reckoning. His participation in the fraud had been exposed, his license was being revoked, and he was facing criminal charges of his own. The most heartbreaking moment came when I looked at Mark and Sarah. My remaining children sat in the gallery, tears streaming down their faces as they listened to the evidence of their complicity. When the recordings of their dismissive comments about my dramatic behavior were broadcast to the world, they broke down completely. They buried their faces in their hands, their shoulders shaking with sobs. When they finally looked up at me, their eyes were filled with a remorse so deep it was almost unbearable to witness. They mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," over and over, but they didn't approach me. They knew, as I knew, that the chasm between us was too wide to bridge with simple apologies. As the trial concluded, I sat in stunned silence. The truth was finally out. The lies had been exposed. The manipulation had been revealed. But victory felt hollow when it came at such a devastating cost to my family. The boy I'd raised as my youngest son, the man I'd sacrificed my career dreams to protect, was facing federal prison. The children I'd taught to love the land were publicly disgraced. The grandchildren I'd nurtured were traumatized by the truth of what their parents had done. But as painful as the legal victory was, I knew the real work was just beginning. Healing from this betrayal, rebuilding my life, reclaiming my land, that would be the true test of my strength. The gavel fell with a sound that echoed through the packed courtroom like the final note of a long, difficult symphony. Judge Williams's voice was firm and unwavering as he delivered the verdict that would reshape all our lives forever. The court finds Peter Patterson and Brenda Patterson guilty of criminal elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy. Peter Patterson is sentenced to 10 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 5 years. Brenda Patterson is sentenced to 7 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 3 years. Peter's face went ashen. 10 years. At 42 years old, he'd spend the next decade of his life behind bars for what he'd done to his own mother. Brenda collapsed into her chair, the weight of her sentence crushing her completely. The court also orders full restitution of the stolen property and funds plus punitive damages totaling $1 million. The farm and all assets obtained through fraudulent means must be returned to the plaintiff immediately. Judge Williams wasn't finished. He turned to address the packed courtroom, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority that would be remembered long after the trial ended. This case represents one of the most systematic and cruel examples of elder abuse this court has ever seen. Ellen Patterson, a respected agronomist who dedicated her life to sustainable farming and environmental stewardship, was victimized by the very people who should have honored her legacy. Her character has been vindicated, her reputation restored, and her life's work reclaimed. The words washed over me like spring rain on fertile soil. After months of being called delusional, paranoid, and mentally unstable, the highest court in the land had declared me not just innocent, but victimized. My professional reputation, my life's work, my scientific legacy, all of it was restored in that moment. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, this court formally recognizes Mrs. Patterson's lifelong integrity as an agronomist and condemns the systematic psychological manipulation of her family members. The false narrative of her mental instability is hereby dismantled and rejected by this court. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. The case had captured national attention, and the verdicts were being analyzed on every major news program. Agricultural experts called it a landmark case for family farm protection. Elder abuse advocates hailed it as a victory for vulnerable seniors everywhere. But the personal reckonings were more complex than the legal ones. 3 weeks after the sentencing, I received a letter from Peter in prison. His handwriting was shaky, his words desperate and rambling. "Mom," he wrote, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I'm writing anyway because I need you to know that I understand what I've done. I'm broken financially and emotionally. I've lost everything, my freedom, my reputation, my family. My $500,000 debt still exists, and now I have no way to pay it." The letter went on for pages, alternating between self-pity and what seemed like genuine remorse. He admitted to the systematic abuse he'd orchestrated, acknowledged the manipulation he'd used against me, and confessed to losing sight of everything I'd taught him about respecting the land. "I turned you into my enemy when you were the only person who ever truly understood the value of what we had," he wrote. "I destroyed something beautiful and irreplaceable for money I didn't even get to keep. I can never undo what I've done, but I want you to know that I'm trying to understand how I became someone who could hurt his own mother so cruelly." I read the letter once, then put it away. Peter's remorse, however genuine, couldn't restore the years of anguish he'd caused. He would serve his sentence and perhaps find some peace in his remaining years, but our relationship was forever changed. Brenda's fate was different. She showed no remorse, no understanding of what she'd done, no hope for redemption. She'd been completely ostracized by the community, abandoned even by her own family, left to serve her sentence in bitter isolation. Mark's path was more complex. 6 months after the sentencing, he entered an intensive rehabilitation program to address what he called his moral failure and cowardice in the face of family pressure. "Mom," he wrote from the facility, "I've been in therapy trying to understand how I became someone who could abandon his own mother. I was scared of confronting Peter, scared of losing my inheritance, scared of making hard choices. I chose financial security over moral courage, and I destroyed our relationship in the process." His letters chronicled his journey of self-discovery, his growing understanding of the psychological dynamics that had destroyed our family. He wrote about the guilt he carried, the shame of his public disgrace, and his desperate hope that someday he might be worthy of my forgiveness. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he wrote. "I don't know if I can ever forgive myself, but I want you to know that I'm working every day to understand what I did, to become a different person, to honor the values you tried to teach me before I lost my way." Sarah's reconciliation was immediate and complete. My daughter had been devastated by the trial revelations, horrified by her own passive complicity in my destruction. She came to me 2 days after the sentencing, her face streaked with tears. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she said, falling into my arms the moment I opened the door. "I was scared and I was weak, and I let them convince me that staying neutral was the same as being innocent. I abandoned you when you needed me most." Sarah's remorse was deep and genuine. She'd spent months in therapy, working through her own guilt and understanding her role in the family dynamics that had nearly destroyed me. Her apologies came with concrete actions. She'd moved back to help me restore the farm, taken early retirement to spend time with me, and begun the process of rebuilding her life around our relationship. "I want to spend the rest of my life making this up to you," she said. "I want to learn about sustainable farming. I want to help you rebuild what they destroyed. I want to be the daughter you deserved all along." The grandchildren's healing was the most important of all. Ethan and Chloe, now 13 and 11, had been devastated by their parents' imprisonment and the revelation of the systematic abuse they'd unknowingly participated in. They'd spent months in therapy, working through their own trauma and guilt. When they finally came to see me 8 months after the trial, they were different children than the ones who'd mocked my dirty farm life. They were quieter, more serious, marked by the knowledge of what their family had done. "Grandma," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I said terrible things to you. I told you to die. I can't believe I said that to my own grandmother." "You were children," I replied, taking his hand. "You were manipulated by adults who should have protected you. You're not responsible for what they made you do." Chloe burst into tears. "We love you, Grandma. We always loved you, even when they were teaching us to hate you. We were just so confused." The process of rebuilding our relationship was slow and careful. The children needed time to process their trauma, to understand the adults who'd failed them, to learn to trust again. But gradually, over many months, we found our way back to each other. They began spending weekends with me on the restored farm, learning about sustainable agriculture, understanding the science behind soil conservation, appreciating the work that goes into environmental stewardship. They wanted to understand what had happened, how manipulation worked, how they could protect themselves and others from similar abuse. This is our real heritage. Chloe said one evening as we watched the sunset over my reclaimed fields. Not the money they wanted to steal, but the land and what it teaches us. My farm was restored to me as part of the restitution, along with all my scientific equipment and research materials that could be recovered. Walking through those fields again, seeing my soil conservation projects intact, sitting in my old office, surrounded by 40 years of research, felt like coming back to life. The victory was bittersweet. I'd reclaimed my land, my reputation, and my dignity, but the cost had been enormous. My family was fractured, probably forever. My youngest son was in prison, my eldest son was in rehabilitation, and my grandchildren bore scars that would last a lifetime. Yet we were also free. Free from Peter's manipulation, free from the lies and deception that had poisoned our relationships, free to build something new and honest from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The trial had made me a public figure, a symbol of resilience and justice for elder abuse victims and family farm protection. Speaking requests poured in from across the country, and publishers were interested in my story. But more importantly, I'd found my purpose again. The land I'd saved had given me a unique perspective on environmental protection and elder rights. I could help others recognize the patterns, fight back against predators, and preserve their legacies. My voice, which had been silenced by institutional walls and legal manipulation, was finally free to teach again. The truth had set us all free, but freedom came with the responsibility to use it wisely. I was Ellen Patterson, and I had work to do. 3 years after the trial, I stood in my restored farmhouse kitchen making coffee, watching the morning light filter through windows that looked out over fields I'd thought I'd lost forever. The farm felt different now, not just reclaimed, but reborn, filled with the kind of deep contentment that comes from surviving the worst and discovering you're stronger than you ever imagined. My health had improved dramatically once the stress of constant legal and emotional warfare was removed. My blood pressure was under control, my weight had returned to normal, and the chronic fatigue that had plagued me during my darkest months was gone. I'd regained my strength, my energy, and most importantly, my connection to the land that had always been my greatest source of peace. The morning ritual of coffee and contemplation had become sacred to me. It was my time to appreciate the simple pleasure of living in my own home, on my own land, making my own choices about how to use and protect it. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful, filled with the sounds of a healthy ecosystem and the potential for continued growth. Sarah arrived at 8 o'clock as she did every morning. She'd moved into the old farmhand's cottage on the property, and we'd developed a routine that brought both of us deep satisfaction. She'd help me with the more physically demanding farm work. We'd review soil analysis reports together, and in the evenings, we'd sit on the porch and plan improvements to our sustainable farming practices. "How did you sleep, Mom?" she asked, kissing my cheek as she entered the kitchen. "Like someone who belongs exactly where she is," I replied, and I meant it. For the first time in years, I slept deeply and peacefully, surrounded by the land I'd spent my life protecting and the family members who'd chosen truth over convenience. Our relationship had transformed into something deeper and more authentic than it had ever been. Sarah's guilt over her past behavior had motivated her to become not just the daughter I'd always hoped for, but a true partner in the work of sustainable agriculture. She'd enrolled in extension courses, learned about soil science, and become genuinely passionate about environmental stewardship. "The organic certification inspector is coming next week," she said, settling into her chair with coffee. "I think we're going to pass with flying colors. The The soil improvement over the past 3 years has been remarkable. I smiled thinking about the transformation we'd accomplished together. Not just the restoration of the land's health, but the rebuilding of our family on a foundation of shared values and honest communication. After finishing my coffee with Sarah, I walked out to survey my fields. The morning glories I'd replanted were climbing up new trellises, and the heritage seed varieties I'd thought were lost forever had been recovered from various seed banks and were thriving once again. I thought about the woman I'd been 4 years ago, broken and defeated, imprisoned in a sterile facility while her life's work was being destroyed. That woman couldn't have imagined the life I was living. Now the purpose I'd found, the peace I'd discovered in rebuilding what had been lost. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Margaret Chen, now my closest collaborator in the work that had become my passion. Ellen, her message read, "The National Agricultural Research Institute wants you to head their new program on family farm preservation. They're offering full funding for a 5-year research project on sustainable inheritance practices." My story had become a powerful tool for education and advocacy. The trial had been widely covered, and the case had become a landmark in elder rights law and agricultural preservation. But more importantly, it had given me a platform to help others protect their land and their legacies from predatory family members. The afternoon brought a familiar visitor, Ethan, now 16, and a junior in high school. He'd become genuinely passionate about environmental science and sustainable agriculture, spending his summers working on the farm and learning about soil conservation and ecological stewardship. "Grandma," he said, settling into the chair beside me on the porch, "I've been thinking about college. I want to study agricultural science and environmental law. I want to help other families protect their farms the way you protected ours." I looked at my grandson, this thoughtful young man who'd grown from the confused child who'd once mocked my dirty farm life. His transformation had been remarkable, his understanding of environmental issues sophisticated and genuine. "I want to make up for what I said to you." He continued, his voice carrying the weight of remembered shame. "I want to help other kids understand how precious agricultural heritage really is, how important it is to protect the land and the people who care for it." "You already have made up for it," I said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Your work here, your genuine love for the land, your commitment to learning, that's all the redemption anyone could ask for." Chloe joined us for dinner, now 14 and passionate about environmental journalism. She'd started a blog about sustainable farming that had attracted national attention, and she was already being recruited by colleges for their environmental studies programs. "I got the scholarship," she announced with pride. "Full ride to study environmental journalism and agricultural communications. I want to tell stories about people like you, Grandma. People who fight to protect what matters." As we sat around my dinner table, Sarah, Ethan, Chloe, and myself, I marveled at how we'd rebuilt our family from the ashes of Peter's destruction. We were smaller now, missing the members who'd chosen greed over principle, but we were stronger, more honest, more connected to our land and our values than we'd ever been. Mark's letters had become more frequent over the past year. His most recent one showed genuine growth and understanding, but also acceptance that some relationships require time and careful rebuilding. "I don't expect immediate forgiveness," he'd written. "I just want you to know that I'm trying to become worthy of the mother who raised me to respect the land and tell the truth." I'd begun responding to his letters cautiously but genuinely. Some wounds heal slowly, but they can heal if both parties are committed to honesty and growth. That evening, As I sat on my porch, watching the sunset over fields I'd nearly lost forever, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey I'd taken. The pain had been enormous, the losses devastating, but the growth had been equally profound. I'd discovered strengths I never knew. I had found purpose in my suffering and learned to trust my own judgment again. I was Ellen Patterson, agronomist, elder abuse survivor, and advocate for agricultural preservation. I was 73 years old, and I was just getting started. My land had been reclaimed, my family had been rebuilt on honest foundations, and my legacy would be one of environmental stewardship, family integrity, and the courage to fight for what matters. The woman who'd once been broken by betrayal had become a beacon of strength for others. The victim had become a victor. The ending had become a beginning. My harvest was complete, but the growing season would continue for generations to come. 4 years have passed since that terrible day when my own son ambushed me with demands to sell our family farm. As I write these words, sitting in my restored farmhouse office with a cup of coffee and tomorrow's planting schedule spread across my desk, I can barely recognize the broken woman I once was. My farm is alive with purpose again. Sarah works beside me daily, bringing fresh energy and genuine passion to sustainable agriculture. Ethan and Chloe spend their school breaks here, learning about environmental stewardship and carrying forward the values that almost died with my generation. Our family meals are smaller than they once were, but they're nourished by truth and authentic love rather than manipulation and greed. I've become something I never expected: a national voice for elder property rights and agricultural preservation. My memoir has inspired thousands of families to protect their land and their legacies. My work with legal advocates and environmental organizations has led to new protections for vulnerable seniors and family farms. Every day I receive letters from people who found the courage to fight back, to reclaim their heritage, to demand the respect they deserve because they heard my story. But perhaps most importantly, I've learned that our deepest strength comes not from blind trust in family, but from unwavering commitment to our principles. I learned that true legacy isn't just what we leave behind, but how we fight to protect it. I discovered that it's never too late to stand up for what matters, to reclaim what's been stolen, to rebuild what's been broken. The greatest lesson of my journey is that integrity cannot be inherited or stolen. It can only be chosen again and again in moments that test our character. I learned that sustainable living applies not just to farming, but to relationships. Both require honest assessment, careful nurturing, and the courage to remove what threatens healthy growth. To anyone listening who feels their legacy being threatened by those who should protect it, trust your knowledge. Your experience matters. Your principles are worth defending. Your voice has power. It is never too late to fight for what you've built, to speak your truth, to demand the respect your life's work deserves. I am Ellen Patterson. I am 73 years old. I am an agronomist, a mother, a grandmother, and a guardian of the land. My farm is my own. My choices are my own. And my legacy is one of environmental stewardship, family honesty, and the enduring power of truth. The storm tried to uproot everything I'd planted, but I chose to grow stronger instead. And in that choice, I found not just survival, but a life of profound meaning and authentic abundance.